Welcome to this webinar presented by the BC Construction Association. I would like to acknowledge that I am speaking to you today from the traditional and ancestral lands of the Lekwungen peoples and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Saanich peoples, whose historical relationships with the land continues to this day. My name is Chris Atchison, and I'm the president of the BCCA, and I am pleased to be here as your host for this session today. Reversal of Fortune, an economic analysis of BC's industrial, commercial, and institutional construction sectors in 2022. At BCCA, we represent employers across BC's ICI construction sectors. We've been doing that for over 50 years and have grown to the point where we're providing information and services to more than 10,000 construction employers across the province. We are unique in that we work for the productivity and resilience of all companies in our industry, regardless of size, location in the province, role, or labor affiliation. As part of our advocacy work, twice a year, we publish what we call our Stat Pack, key data points that show the size and influence of and outlook for our sector. Annually, we also publish the results of our industry survey, which goes behind the data to the issues, gathering and sharing real-life perspective and experiences from the contractors and the tradespeople, all who are nobly building our province. These documents have come to play an important role in demonstrating the role of our sector and aligning stakeholder partners across the industry. In 2022, of course, it has been an exceptional year coming on the heels of the pandemic and in the midst of global turbulence. So this year, BCCA commissioned an outside expert to undertake an unbiased review of the economic and policy environment for our industry in British Columbia. We sought a consultant already familiar with the construction sector who could provide new insights and hopefully validation for the focus of our advocacy efforts on everything from the skilled worker shortage through to prompt payment legislation. Now, just before I introduce our presenter and turn the mic over to him, a couple of housekeeping notes. We will take questions at the end, but feel free to put them in the Q&A section as they occur to you. The webinar will be recorded and made available on the BCCA website. And the paper that Dr. Basu has written will also be available from the BCCA website, along with our fall 2022 Stat Pack. They will both be published today. Now, it gives me great pleasure to turn the mic over to Dr. Anirban Basu, Chairman and CEO of Sage Policy Group, economist and public policy expert with an MPP from the Harvard Kennedy School. Dr. Basu is the chief economist for several construction industry organizations, including the Associated Builders and Contractors of America and the Construction Financial Management Association. He's an avid sports enthusiast who counts the Washington Capitals amongst his favorite sports team, and thus takes great pleasure in the current state of our Vancouver Canucks. Over to you, Dr. Basu.
Right, Chris. I don't take great pleasure in it. I only take mild pleasure, and I got to tell you. But thank you very much, everyone, for being here today. Thank you very much to the British Columbia Construction Association for having me, allowing me to write that paper that I hope some of you will read, if not all of you, and to present to you today some of our key findings. And as Chris had noted, please use that question and answer box to ask what questions you would like. We have about an hour here, but I'm not going to speak for an entire hour, so we should have a goodly amount of time to address your questions. The presentation today is entitled A Market Analysis of British Columbia's Industrial, Commercial, and Institutional, or ICI, construction sectors. Let's get right to it. And so let's talk about the macroeconomic overview. Obviously, we've been in the midst of this public health emergency that in many ways continues to linger, as it turns out. And you can see its various manifestations in the form of supply chain disruptions and some other phenomena that we will talk about. But let's talk about investment in buildings. And that has, as it turns out, plummeted during the pandemic. Though I must tell you, to the untrained eye, it might not look that way. This is investment in ICI building construction in British Columbia. I'm going to try to show you as much British Columbia specific data as possible today. There are three lines here. That blue line that's at the top here, that's commercial. And that doesn't look so bad, does it? I mean, obviously, we had that downturn economically during the early stages of the pandemic. We've been recovering for quite some time now, many quarters. And what this suggests is that, well, we're making headway back to pre-pandemic levels of construction. You can see that, as it turns out, construction volumes are akin to what they might have been in, let's say, 2018 or 2019. So not bad, not terrible. There's a gray line in the middle there. That's your institutional and government spending. That also looks pretty stable. That doesn't look so bad. And then industrial is the rust-colored line at the bottom, or brown-colored line. And that also, while we're off the peak, as it turns out, for the cycle, none of this looks awful. None of this looks catastrophic. And it would therefore seem as if the word plummeting was too strong, is what I'm trying to say. But this is in current dollars. This is not adjusted for inflation. And as you know, inflation in Canada has been red hot, as has been the case throughout North America. And so what one needs to do probably is adjust these numbers for inflation to really show how busy the industry is. Your costs have gone up, as you know. You've been striving to pass along, to the extent possible, your cost increases, whether they're employee related or whether they're materials related or whether they're equipment related, to project owners. But at the end of the day, if your costs rise and your prices rise, that doesn't really tell us how you're doing, at least in terms of profitability. So let's look at this from a different perspective. Let's look at this in both current dollar terms, which is the blue-colored line here. So this is overall ICI building construction. And then the red line is inflation adjusted, constant 2012 dollars. And what you see here now is, oh, I see, it's much worse than it looked when you don't adjust for inflation, right? The industry just has not fared nearly as well if you take out or strip out some of these inflationary forces. And so we'll talk more about this and what's been happening. But here's the thing. Even though this does not look very impressive, and we are nowhere close in British Columbia in terms of ICI building construction to pre-pandemic levels of construction, at least in real terms, meaning inflation-adjusted terms here in red, you might say, well, at least we're bouncing back. But the question then becomes, will we continue to bounce back? Will we continue to recover? The early phases of recovery from the pandemic have been quite strong, as you know. But one could also argue that what has happened in North America is that the North American economy has become overheated. So yes, it's been growing, but it's also been adding inflationary pressures all over the course of time. So as a result of that, policymakers, particularly monetary policymakers, are taking actions to slow Canadian economic growth. We see the same thing in the United States. So these are data back to 2010, as it turns out. You can see the last three bars here, 2021. So a rapid year of recovery from the worst stages of the pandemic. 2020, of course, was a year during which Canadian gross domestic product falls 5.2%. The projection for 2022 year end is around 3.3% growth. This is from the International Monetary Fund. And then the projection for next year is for much softer growth. And indeed, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund are projecting global economic recession next year. I, for my own country, the United States of America, I'm predicting a quite deep recession. And I think that forecasters generally are still too optimistic about the economic outlook, that this economy is crashing into a wall. And again, a lot of it has to do with high inflation and not enough workers. We'll talk about all of these things. But construction and real estate are very interest rate sensitive. And we've seen this burst of inflation over the course of the pandemic. In fact, this is the Canadian Consumer Price Index. Back to January of 2012, 12-month percentage change is what, well, actually what it's showing is the actual value of the index, but the caption on the southeast slide, southeast portion of the slide is showing year-over-year increase. Year-over-year increase is 6.9%. So Canadian inflation over the past year running at around 7%. Now that's better than in July. In July, Canadian inflation was running at around 7.6%, so that's better. Nonetheless, inflation remains very, very high. And since February of 2020, if you again look at that caption for the southeast corner of the slide, 11.1% price increase overall. And so policymakers can't deal with this. They don't like this level of inflation. It does distort markets. It's very difficult to transact economically when you've got these high rates of inflation. So what do policymakers do? Well, you know what they do. They increase borrowing costs. They tighten monetary policy. They raise interest rates. This is the Bank of Canada's target overnight lending rate. The analogous rate in America is the Fed funds rate, the overnight lending rate. So banks can lend one another reserves overnight. That rate is set by the central banks. In America, the Federal Reserve; in Canada, the Bank of Canada. Now, when the year began, this benchmark interest rate was at 0.25%. It's now at 3.25%. So that's a 3 percentage point increase in this interest rate. We've had exactly the same, by the way, increase in interest rates in America, where the benchmark interest rate is also around 3.25% and began the year close to zero. And, it would appear that the Bank of Canada is following the Federal Reserve. And some of you might want to, like to hear things like this, but you know who I blame for all this? Can I tell you who I blame for all this? The Americans. Now, that has got to bring joy into your Canadian heart. It's not so much into mine, I got to tell you, but it's the Americans. Because it was the Americans, the US federal government, and the US Federal Reserve, our central bank, that overstimulated the economy, that overheated the economy. There were other factors at work, supply chain disruptions, for instance, which have lingered. I mean, other forces have pushed inflation higher beyond monetary or fiscal policy, but the Americans overheated their economy. All that stimulus through 2021. And now the Americans, suffering from 8.2% inflation, are trying to bring inflation back to that 2% target. So how do they do that? They raise interest rates. You might ask the question, well, why does the Bank of Canada have to follow suit? Because when the Federal Reserve raises US interest rates, that makes holding US bonds more attractive because the interest rate has gone up. So you can generate more income from holding those US bonds. When people buy US bonds, of course, they have to buy those in US dollar denominated assets. They have to use US dollars. So those rising interest rates raise the value of the dollar. So, as you know, the US dollar. So you may know that today a Canadian dollar can buy around 74 cents US, and that's better than a couple of weeks ago when it was 72 cents that the Canadian dollar could buy of the US dollar, 72 cents, or 74 cents. But here's the point. If the Bank of Canada does not also increase its interest rates, the value of the Canadian dollar will fall. And what's the problem with that? Well, many problems, but the number one issue here is that's inflationary, because the Canadian dollar could now buy less, and that means that every item costs more. That's inflation. So as long as the Americans keep tightening their monetary policy, and they will, so their next meeting is November 1st and 2nd, I'm speaking of the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States, when they raise interest rates on November 2nd, at some point, my presumption is the Bank of Canada will follow suit. So you've already seen this massive increase in borrowing costs. And why does this matter so much to this audience, this ICI audience? Because, of course, real estate and construction are heavily leveraged. One of the things we know that's been happening is that construction materials prices have skyrocketed. I'll give you an example. In my country, concrete prices are up 14.3% over the past year. Typically, concrete prices rise around 2 to 3% in America, 14.3%. And concrete is ubiquitous. But you can look at other prices in the economy, and they're also quite high. And so the issue here is that you've got rising borrowing costs. So developers or people who purchase construction services are facing higher interest rates. Their costs that in some cases you have to pass along to them, their materials costs are rising as well. Workers are becoming more expensive. We'll talk about that in a moment. And as the economy is weakening, what does that translate into? Diminished construction value. That's what I'm trying to get at here, diminished construction value. So in a high price, high interest rate environment, you would expect to see construction demand taper off. And that's exactly what we have. Rising costs, borrowing costs, and materials costs. Let's talk about some of these construction costs now. So this is the Canadian Non-Residential Building Construction Price Index. And again, you can see during the pandemic how sharp the increase was or has been in construction materials prices. Just unbelievable. And so here's the issue. For much of the recovery to date in North America, what I have noticed among contractors is this, what they've told me is this, that yes, our costs are up, but the recovery was so strong and borrowing costs were so low, and there's so much capital to invest that we were generally able to find buyers of our construction services, and we're able to generally pass along our cost increases to buyers or developers, project owners. And so in some cases, we were able to support even higher margin. It's been a good period, actually. It's been a solid period of recovery. But some of you have also told me on past occasions that some of your project owners, some of the people for whom you work, are not that happy about these price increases, and they're starting to push back. And they're likely to push back harder when their other costs, meaning borrowing costs, have gone up sharply, and when there's more pervasive pessimism in the economy, and therefore they're doing everything they can to reduce their costs to try to eke out some profit from their development. None of this is setting up particularly well. I mean, you might have thought, well, I was depressed by the Vancouver Canucks. I would say this is more depressing. And here's another issue. The construction labor force in British Columbia, graphed here back to 1976. This is the size of that labor force. Recently it's been shrinking. Now, this labor force has accomplished incredible things, as you know. Vancouver is a global jewel. And I've read, back in 2014 and other articles, the highest concentration of high-rise buildings per capita in the world. And I'm not sure if that is still true, but certainly, much of British Columbia, all of British Columbia is a jewel, but a lot of that beauty is not simply God-made, which is the most spectacular beauty, of course, but also human-made. But you can see, and one of the issues you've had is that the construction labor force has not provided you with sufficient skills, that a lot of the best construction workers, often older construction workers, have been retiring in large numbers. Younger people often have not been entering the skilled construction trades for a variety of reasons, including they don't want to work outdoors, for instance, or they want to drive Uber or Lyft or whatever they want to do. And so this is another source of cost increase. So now what you're dealing with as a contractor, an ICI contractor, is a slow recovery in real terms from the pandemic, worsening macroeconomic conditions, rising materials prices, equipment delays, a shrinking construction labor force in British Columbia. These are not easy times for a construction industry that is a jewel, that built Vancouver, that built those high rises, and not to mention the construction of Victoria and other parts of British Columbia. So that's where we are right now. I think the outlook is pretty dire. And as I said a moment ago, in my own nation, the United States of America, I expect a quite deep recession next year. And I've been telling contractors, look, I get it. Right now, you have significant backlog headed into 2023. You feel pretty comfortable. Maybe this economy doesn't catch up to you in 2023, therefore, because backlog maybe carries you through next year, but maybe it's 2024, 2025, it's going to get tougher. Now, because there is this paucity of workers, at a time when construction has been in recovery, this is what you see with respect to average weekly construction wages. This is the percentage change in wages since January of 2017. So not quite 5 years ago. Sorry, actually not quite 6 years ago, not quite 6 years ago. These data run through July of 2022. And what it says is that between January of 2017 and July of 2022, so that's, I think, precisely 5.5 years, a 26% increase in British Columbia in construction wages. Now, one of the things you might be familiar with is that construction worker productivity hasn't necessarily been expanded. And in fact, by many metrics, it's actually been in decline. Why? Because who's retiring? The best, most dedicated, most skilled construction workers. Who's coming into the industry? Often unskilled laborers. In fact, in the United States, the fastest growing occupation category in construction is unskilled laborer. So the hope is in the United States, among many contractors, they'll hire these folks. They hope they show up to work. If they can show up to work maybe a week or for maybe 2 weeks, maybe they've proven by that point that they're sufficiently committed to be trained up, to become more productive workers. But because British Columbia's recovery has been stronger than overall Canada's, you don't see strong recovery economically in New Brunswick or some other parts of Canada. British Columbia is magical. It's a beautiful place. And of course, Vancouver is often viewed as the most beautiful city in North America. So, we have seen faster wage growth as a result of that. It's a busier place, more demand for construction services in British Columbia than in Canada. In Canada, construction wages are up 14.8% over the past 5.5 years for which we have data. But again, one of the things you think about is the higher something rises, the further it can fall. And so, again, the economic conditions are changing very, very quickly. The costs are not going to fall very, very quickly. And that concerns me with respect to the profit margins of our contractors. And there's some additional challenges on top of the macroeconomics we've discussed. And again, we can talk during the Q&A portion of this about all these issues. We can talk about the macroeconomic issues or anything else. But let me talk about some additional structural challenges to the ICI construction segment in British Columbia. And some of these challenges are semi-unique to contractors in British Columbia. So I'll give you an example: paid sick leave. Right, so on top of a challenging economic environment, and in fact, an increasingly challenging economic environment, is an increasingly challenging legislative and regulatory one. Paid sick leave. As of January 1st, 2022, employers in British Columbia are required to provide at least 5 days of paid sick leave to any employee who has worked for the organization for at least 90 days. Now, I'm not against paid sick leave. When people get sick, and we've been through this public health emergency, you don't want them to lose income and so on and so forth. So I understand this, but I want to give you a little secret, tell you a little secret, just between us. And I know this is being taped, but I presume it's not going to be played outside of the four corners of this audience. There are some people, again, this is a secret between you and me. There are some people who might claim to be sick, even though they're not. Yes, I've said it. I know what you'll say to me, Anirban, I'm so sorry, that never happens. I think it happens, okay, at least occasionally. And what does that mean? That means you're paying for people who are not working for whatever reason. That drives your costs. But of course, wage costs are already rising. Materials prices are elevated. Equipment is in short supply. And now you're facing, at least prospectively, less demand for your services. The math simply does not add up. Everything is pushing against you, is what I'm trying to say, in terms of your prosperity. Employers are required, second bullet here, employers are required to pay their employees their regular wages on these days. The law applies to both full and part-time workers. So you can have a part-time worker working for you for about 90 days. They say, look, I'm taking 5 days off. I'm very sick. Now, again, they might be very sick. So please, I understand that some of this is completely legitimate. I'm just saying that some people might game the system. I've seen it. This policy has further strained an industry already saddled with rising costs and acute worker shortages. This policy effectively represents a 2% increase in labor costs in addition to the measured cost increases approaching 9% between February 2020 and May of 2022 that occurred in the context of diminished construction spending. Costs up, activity down. And then now, of course, you've got another mandate on top of that. So, this concerns me. And one of the things I would say to legislators in British Columbia is, look, you have a construction industry that's an absolute jewel of an industry. And perhaps we would say that of construction segments in every community. But the construction industry in British Columbia helped build Vancouver. And that is really special. So much human-made beauty. I do not see that quality of construction in many other communities, certainly not in the United States. So when you've got such a capable industry that's able to do so much, you want to make sure that that industry is healthy, that that industry can continue to improve the built environment. But again, policies like this do not help. Lack of prompt payment legislation. So despite industry efforts, British Columbia still lacks prompt payment legislation. The 2019 Builders Lien or Prompt Payment Amendment Act would have required an owner to pay a contractor within 28 days of receiving a proper invoice, 28 days, a month of receiving a proper invoice, The money is owed, 28 days. It would also have required contractors to pay their subcontractors within 7 days of receiving payment from a project owner. Okay, 7 days, so the money is there. Right, the project owner has paid, the money is there, and now the subcontractor wants to be recompensed for their expenditures. And they have to wait 7 days, or up to 7 days under the legislation. Of course, it did not pass. What does that mean for the contractor? Well, you've got rising interest rates. You're into your line of credit. waiting to be paid for the work you have done. And that interferes with your cash flow. The legislation did not pass, contributing to lingering financial uncertainty among contractors in the process. Now, look, other communities have seen fit to pass this kind of legislation. Ontario has had similar legislation in place since October of 2019. Saskatchewan since March of 2022, Alberta since August of 2022, and Quebec is currently running a pilot project mandating prompt payment. So this is not some kind of exotic policy. This is something that's becoming increasingly mainstream and would very much help in the context of the current economic environment, given that we have so much uncertainty and given that holding debt is more expensive now. The waiting to be paid is more expensive now compared to when interest rates were much lower at the beginning of the year. With costs rising and the economic landscape increasingly treacherous, a majority of contractors, 52%, are predictably concerned about prompt payment. And I don't know that this is going to be the case, but I expect that fraction or proportion will rise. Why? Because the macroeconomic environment is going to get tougher. And therefore, prompt payment becomes that much more important to many contractors. And I'll go over more why this might really matter in British Columbia. Passage of prompt payment legislation in 2022 would supply greater certainty regarding contractor cash flow, thereby inducing additional hiring and perhaps setting the stage for higher compensation levels, which is what policymakers want. They want more jobs and higher pay. But contractors cannot do that. They can't increase the size of their staffs or better compensate them if they themselves don't have the money. If they don't have the money because they haven't been paid, then no one wins. No one wins, I guess, unless it's a project owner who's holding on to the money for whatever reason, but we want prompt payment. So one British Columbia Construction Association member explained the following in a conversation, that, quote, lack of payment has crippling ramifications for not only our business, but tradespeople, suppliers, industry professionals, and the community at home. While another lamented that, quote, nothing keeps me up at night except customers that don't or won't pay bills on time. Now, I find that a little disingenuous. I'm quite sure that this person is also kept up at night by the play of the Vancouver Canucks. But nonetheless, the point here is that you can understand how macroeconomically or industry specifically, this is leading to a problem that many contractors might find themselves with cash flow issues going forward for reasons we've got into on numerous occasions. Now, I have an anonymous attendee asking a question, so let me address it in the flow of play. With rising interest rates, do we expect construction costs for materials, not labor, to decrease? If so, is there a lag before we see any decrease in these costs, such as 1 year? It's a great question. I'll address it right now. Thank you for the question. So I would say this, that materials prices will not continue to rise as they have been. They won't. And it depends on the material, of course. And there's always explanations for why this happens. So with respect to softwood lumber, for instance, and I know there's a lot of ICI construction, so softwood lumber is not as important in this context as it might be for residential contractors. But nonetheless, softwood lumber, what happened? The sawmills shut down early during the pandemic. Mortgage rates fell to record lows in North America. All of a sudden, there was a massive demand for new home construction as people wanted to more aggressively social distance, take advantage of those low mortgage rates, wanted more room for home offices and home gyms. And so we saw this in both Canada and the United States. And builders put in their softwood lumber package orders all at one time. The sawmills were not ready to do that. They didn't have enough blades and other equipment to handle that. Softwood lumber prices took off early during the pandemic. Very frustrating. Now, with respect to steel prices, you remember steel prices, copper prices, other prices have been quite high for much of the pandemic, but steel prices have been falling more recently. Why is that? I would say that's because of emerging global economic weakness, particularly in China. At the beginning of the year, the expectation was that the Chinese economy might grow around 5.5%. The current expectation is closer to 2.5%. There's a real estate crisis now in China, and obviously that frustrates construction activity. And so the demand for materials coming out of China is much less than it would normally be. And that means more materials for the rest of the world. And that would tend to drive prices lower, all things being equal. So it really depends upon the materials price. I expect the global economy to head into recession in 2023. So I expect to see a further decimation of demand for inputs to construction. And so it should be the case that we'll see some relief. And by the way, is it not true that oil prices, for instance, have fallen? And part of that is because the global economy is weaker. Natural gas prices have fallen. Part of that is because the economy is weaker, despite all the devastation in Ukraine. and an impending energy crisis in Europe, we still see falling natural gas prices in much of North America. So it is possible for prices to fall. Economic weakness would correspond to falling prices, and I think you will begin to see that next year. Again, one of the reasons the economy is slowing in North America is because that's being engineered. It's an engineered slowdown. The Federal Reserve is in the United States and the Bank of Canada in Canada is striving to slow down economic growth to weed excess inflation out of the economy. So again, great question. Thank you very much for it. I really appreciate that. So let's take a look at why this means so much potentially to many British Columbia ICI construction stakeholders. So let's look at a risk profile of a typical ICI contractor. So according to research supplied by the British Columbia Construction Association, the typical contractor operating in British Columbia is relatively small. 92% of construction companies in British Columbia report fewer than 20 employees. They're small, but they're not just small, they're often young. Has less than a decade of experience. The median contractor has been operating for only 5 to 10 years and therefore often remains fragile financially and otherwise. These are young businesses. And why have we seen a burst of young businesses? Because British Columbia has been a great place to be an entrepreneur, to start a business. It's been a wonderfully robust economic environment for contractors. But even an economy as strong as British Columbia has got to feel the sting of these rising borrowing costs, these rising interest rates, and slowing global economic growth. Not to mention, by the way, some of the other trends that we see in commercial real estate. For instance, remote work and the effect of that on office space demand, or remote shopping, online shopping, and the effect on shopping center construction, or remote meetings like this one and the effect on hotel room demand. And so there's some structural changes fomented by the pandemic that have diminished, in some cases, demand for certain types of construction, office buildings, hotels, shopping centers. May have increased demand for other types of construction, however, fulfillment centers, data centers, healthcare facilities, industrial and manufacturing facilities. That's true. But some of these really big segments, like the office segments, really being hit hard, of course, by behavioral changes. The typical contractor also is concerned about skilled labor shortages. Notice I spelled labor the Canadian way because that's how much I care about you. 80% of contractors are concerned about skilled labor shortages. Is concerned about prompt payment. 52% of contractors is increasingly less likely to recommend a career in construction. 69% of contractors. Now that is damning. When contractors are saying, in an environment that has been as dynamic as British Columbia's, I don't think you should come into this sector, daughter or son, or nephew or niece. I don't think this is for you. I do something else. That tells you how difficult things have already become. And this is even before 2023, which stands to be an awfully challenging year for many. And then that typical contractor, despite all these challenges, offers employee benefits, 91%, and has raised wages in 2022, 76%. So they do right by their team members. And they raise wages, they provide benefits, but they need help. They need help. So what's the conclusion here? These are challenging times for British Columbia's contractors. Many have little to no experience dealing with a period of economic stress. Right, in 2008 financial crisis, which by the way, was not nearly as bad in Canada as in the United States, was now 14 years ago. So a lot of these businesses have never been through a down cycle. Now they're, some of them will feel the sting of a down cycle. Will they be able to survive? And what you don't want to have is a lot of construction firm failure, because some of these firms deliver very specialized services. So if you lose that firm, you often lose a significant fraction of the capacity to provide those specialized services. And that drives costs higher, by the way. They are encountering diminished construction activity amidst rising project financing costs, shifts in behavior that have negatively impacted key commercial, institutional, and public segments, equipment shortages, surging materials prices, and skilled worker shortages. Everything is moving in the same direction, and it's working against the construction community. Risk of recession remains high, which also means that timely payment from project owners or other contractors is becoming less certain in an environment in which prompt payment legislation failed to pass. In other words, when times are tough, people take longer to pay. And that creates a Hobson's choice for folks. Do I take the project on? Do I do the work? Do I take on the expense of that for fear of not being paid in a timely fashion, so that I take a hit financially because of that? I work hard and I take, because of my hard work, a hit financially. And that's sort of what people are facing, absent things like prompt payment legislation. So again, the industry could use some support, and prompt payment legislation would be an element of that support. Absent some degree of intervention like that, British Columbia may experience significant contractor failure during the quarters ahead, which would further compromise industry capacity and drive construction delivery costs even higher. And that is my presentation to you today. It's not a particularly upbeat presentation, but you're used to bad news because you are Canucks fans. So that helped prepare you for all of this. So in any case, let me stop sharing and let's go to Q&A, Chris.
Yeah, great. Thank you for the presentation, Dr. Bazou. And I see we've got a couple of questions coming in. One from Christy Kerr. What kinds of interventions could help prevent contractor failure in the current economic climate?
Look, contractors have been saying we want prompt payment legislation. We need the money to flow. We can't have bottlenecks in the flow of money, because when there are bottlenecks in the flow of money, someone's going to go under, at least potentially. And so that is one. Now, we've been saying that there's a structural issue here. There are not enough skilled construction workers, and not enough Canadians, and this is also true for Americans, of course, consider the skilled construction trades as a pathway to prosperity. But they are pathways to prosperity. Working in construction is not for everyone, but neither is a four-year college degree. Right? We all have our proclivities, we all have our propensities, we all have our dreams. And not enough young people are being exposed to skilled construction trades. And so one of the things that can happen here, and I think it's a rising tide that lifts all boats, of course, is more investment in helping train the industrial workforce of the future. I mean, the construction industry and the manufacturing segment. So we don't have enough mechanics and machinists. We don't have enough welders. We don't have enough pipe fitters. We don't have enough electricians and plumbers. We don't have enough roofers and glaziers, millwrights, so on and so forth. All of these are middle-income jobs, carpenters, so on and so forth. So that's what I would say, would be some positive examples of policy intervention.
Great, and that's and that's similar to the second question. I think you may have already started your answer for that one as well. Is prompt payment the lowest hanging fruit for policymakers, and what are the other opportunities for policymakers to keep construction going as the economy slows down?
Yeah, I think prompt payment is the lowest hanging fruit, and I'll tell you why, Chris. Is because the government doesn't have to spend any money. Right? They don't have to spend any money. So, if we're talking about supporting apprenticeship programs or, providing more programming in area colleges or within high schools and so on and so forth, that's money. That's public funds in many cases. But with respect to prompt payment legislation, all you're trying to do is make sure that the money flows from project owner to contractor to contractor. That's what you're trying to do. Doesn't cost government anything. And of course, other governments have seen fit in Canada to do exactly this. And I don't see them crying out to reverse this legislation, by the way, in Ontario or elsewhere. So yes, yes, I think I have answered it, but that is in fact, I think, the lowest hanging fruit.
Fantastic. Now, this next question is about sending copies of the slides. The economic report is going to be released today following this presentation, and so it will be available for everybody. And we have recorded the session, which will also be available. So we're not sending around copies of the slides, but most of the content that is that you've seen in the slides today is also included in the report that will be released today. So I hope that answers that question. And now a question from Tom at Kinetic. Economic climate is one challenge, but how does the construction industry need to systematically evolve, or do we?
Yeah, Tom, this is a great question. And as you probably know, construction infamously has been known for generating very slow productivity growth. Productivity is typically measured as output per hour worked. And throughout North America, we just have not seen the kinds of productivity growth in construction that we've seen in manufacturing and many other industries. And one of the reasons for this, I think, is that there are technologies out there that can bolster productivity. But the problem is that to switch technological frameworks, one needs a pretty well-trained construction team. In other words, asking people to change how they do things requires commitment and also some significant intellect and training. And to the extent that that training is not endowed presently in that construction workforce, it's hard to switch technologies. And so what I'm trying to say here is that implementing or installing new technologies or new standard operating procedures is difficult when you're already facing an insufficiently skilled workforce. And so, how do we bolster construction productivity? My very strong sense is that firms have to take a really close look at available technologies and determine what they can productively institute or install or adopt to raise their productivity. Because until we start producing more construction workers, we're probably going to have to become more capital intensive as an industry. So that's, I think, how construction has got to evolve. And by the way, better technology might also mean better environmental outcomes for construction. One of the other things that can happen, I think is going to happen, is you'll see more modular construction, more indoor construction, more construction taking place in controlled settings. It's easier for people to work indoors. It's easier for people to not have to deal with variables like weather when they're constructing projects indoors. To a certain extent, right now, everything can be done indoors. We all know that. But I think modular construction will also be one of the big winners going forward.
Great. We've got a two-part question here from Kristen, and it's, do you see similar challenges manifesting in the US at present? And does it mirror what we're seeing in Canada? And if so, are there steps being taken that look promising?
I mean, the two countries are separate in certain ways. I mean, the capitals are very good. But yes, in terms of construction, yes, very similar challenges, right? I mean, we like to think we're different, the Americans and the Canadians, but and we are in certain ways. There's no question about that. I understand that. But in terms of workforce patterns, in terms of demographic patterns, so both Canada and the United States had baby boom generations, for instance, surge in births after World War II, that kind of thing. So demographically, there's a lot of overlap there. And I think we see very similar things. So the same frustrations that are facing Canadian contractors, if you talk to US contractors, which perhaps you have, they're going to talk about the same things. Number one issue for American construction firms, can't find workers. Number two, or tied for number two, is equipment shortages and higher materials prices. But I think, if I were a contractor, the thing that would concern me the most right now, obviously all these things are of concern, is these higher borrowing costs. Because if you speak to developers, the people who buy construction services in many cases, they'll tell you that as much as construction materials prices have taken off, when you look at their pro forma, what really has made their pro formas more challenging in terms of penciling out, allowing them to move forward with the project financially, are those higher borrowing costs. That really does increase the cost of development more even than these construction materials costs, and that's what's keeping a lot of projects on the sidelines. And unfortunately, we're in this period where interest rates are set to continue to increase because both the Bank of Canada and the Federal Reserve are up to the same thing. They're both raising interest rates to try to curb inflation. And we both notice we both have inflationary problems in our countries, another overlapping phenomenon. So yes, I think that long story short, the challenges are very similar.
Okay, and how might institutional construction project owners help contractors to successfully deliver the services during turbulent times?
Yeah, this is really important. This is about communication. And I know that doesn't sound particularly technical, but I tell you, I've spoken to many purchasers of construction services, like healthcare systems, for instance, medical systems, and others who, for instance, will get a bid from a construction firm, let's say in February or March. Then they will go through their process of deciding when to begin construction, lining up their finances, talking to the board, and so on and so forth. They will come back 4 months later to that contractor and hear that the project cost has gone up 20 or 30%. And I'm actually dealing with an issue like this here in Maryland with a major medical system here. But there has been no communication in the interim between contractor and prospective purchaser of construction services. So I think one of the things that the industry can do is try to help purchasers of construction services understand what's driving the cost. Why are there these escalations? Try to make them feel more comfortable with these bids. These bids are high and often higher than people's budgets going into the bidding process. But if people understand what's driving costs higher, whether it's materials prices or labor or, financing costs or whatever it happens to be, I think that that's very helpful. So I think that that's one way that institutional construction project owners can help. It's just to make sure that the lines of communication are open. And of course, the contractor needs to also do their part to make sure the lines of communication are open, because the fact of the matter is concrete's going to cost what it's going to cost. Steel's going to cost what it's going to cost. But as long as the provider of services explains that to the purchaser, I think you get much better outcomes.
Great, thank you for that. Here's a question from Randy. So I'm using Randy's words here. I've been predicting defaults in the residential construction sector due to unequal cash flows and undercapitalized business models since spring of 2022, but have yet to see this. Do you think I called it wrong or just too soon?
Randy, just too soon. I think you're right. It's going to happen. There's a lot of fragility out there. I can tell you what's happened in the United States, for instance. I follow that segment of the economy very carefully, the residential construction segment, particularly single-family home building segment. And what's happened here is that up until March or April, the housing market was red hot. And indeed, the Federal Reserve does not start raising interest rates until March of this year, and only by 0.25% at that time, almost nothing. So so a lot of builders, pulled permits, got permissions to build, and started building projects. And then here's the problem. Here's what happened to them. We have nearly a record number of homes, single-family homes under construction in America, believe it or not. But it's not because contractors are ebullient or are very optimistic. It's because they haven't been able to finish the homes they started a year or two ago. Right? They can't find garage doors and other components. They just can't get to their use and occupancy permit. So what has happened is now they've been under construction, ready to deliver these single-family homes. But in the interim, the market has turned from very strong to extremely weak. Many buyers are returning or asking for a return of their deposits. They're avoiding the deal because the mortgage rates are so high now. And so a lot of these builders are going to start finishing these homes. They're better off finishing the homes than not finishing the homes, but then they'll have to sell the homes at a discount. And in some instances, some of these residential builders, especially the small ones, I'm not talking about the big ones, but the small ones, they're not going to make it. They're not going to survive this. And their banker and their bonding company, their insurer, is going to say, enough is enough. You've taken big losses here. We can't support you any further. They're going to lose their line of credit. They're going to go out of business. So I think that you just have to wait, and your prediction, Randy, will come to pass, unfortunately.
Here's a question from Joanne. In the Victoria area, contractor availability for building renewal projects like balcony replacements and building envelopes has been very tight. As well, engineering firms are suggesting cost increases to an amount that has really scared strata owners facing special levies for these types of projects. When do you foresee this pressure easing up and these kinds of projects being more affordable again?
Joanne, I'm going to take a guess here. I'm going to say 2024, 2025. Right? I think that, we're in this overheated economic environment. So everything is more expensive right now. People, permits, whatever it happens to be, everything's gone up in cost. Engineering, architectural services, you name it. But I think that this next year, year and a half, 24 months, so on and so forth, are going to be quite a tumultuous one for the North American economy. Again, I'm predicting recession. Now, could I be wrong? Of course, I'm an economist. We tend to be wrong. But that's my prediction. And as a result of that, when you have a recession, when you have a downturn, when you have fewer projects moving forward, given higher borrowing costs and more pervasive pessimism, all of a sudden, contractor availability becomes a bit less tight, right? More contractors are searching for work. In some cases, you might see actually some contractors bidding with very little margin in their bids. And we saw this in America after the 2008 episode. There's lots of complaints about contractors who were bidding on projects with almost no margin or profit built into their bids and very little, if any, contingency. They want to get busy again. So I don't know that we'll see anything like that in Canada in the next couple of years, but I think you will see more availability of construction firm capacity. And as I mentioned earlier, materials prices should be a bit lower, and construction wages probably won't be rising as quickly because, unfortunately, some construction workers probably are about to lose their jobs, especially in that residential segment.
Great, thank you. What have you seen in other parts of Canada or the US to get more people into the sector? For example, construction companies visiting high schools in grades 11 and 12 to educate them early about the opportunities in this industry.
Yeah, I have seen that, of course. We see more contractors going into career days in high schools and trying to get people excited. We've seen a lot more support for apprenticeship programs. So one of the issues, unfortunately, for apprenticeship programs is that, the model is a good one. So, people are being paid to be in these apprenticeship programs while they're learning the skills. That's wonderful, right? They're not, it's not like going to a university where you're paying tuition, you're not making money, and then you come out and get a job. You're an apprentice, you're making money while you're being trained. It's a beautiful thing. But one of the issues here is that the economy has been so good, whether in British Columbia or elsewhere, that a lot of people have just failed to finish those apprenticeship programs. They take a job someplace before they actually finish the program. So it's frustrating. Because you need some scale in these apprenticeship programs, some number of students to make it worthwhile, to make it financially viable. So that's one thing that can happen. But I think really what we need in North America is a bit of educational reform. In America, at least, the word vocational is almost a pejorative, right? We don't talk about vocational training anymore. Vocational training is for kids that aren't that bright. That's basically what sort of the notion is. That's nonsense. In Germany, they have different pathways to success, and so you might see in a German newspaper, you see this frequently enough, somebody graduates from a 2-year apprenticeship program and they're featured in the newspaper, a young person, because they take great pride in craftsmanship in that part of Europe, Germany, Switzerland, so on and so forth. They take great pride in that. I think we need to have that kind of pride. That it shouldn't just be about computer jobs or professorships or so on and so forth, or working as a hedge fund manager or in private equity. No, that there is glory in all work done competently, and we need to have a better built environment. And to have a better built environment, we need to have a better class of construction workers and more construction workers. That's significant. And if we could get more educational reform so that young people could be exposed in the classroom to these pathways to prosperity, if that's their interest, junior or senior year of high school, as an example, in the United States, I think it would be much the betterment of society, because 4-year college is not for everyone, but we educators often act as if it is.
Well said. You mentioned Germany in that last response, and here's another question from Randy about how does North American construction productivity compare to European construction productivity?
I think we're probably pretty competitive, but that's with Europe, right? So Europe has its own set of labor laws, has its own demographic conditions. The Europeans are getting older faster than North Americans. So you've got even more of those skilled tradespeople who grew up in the 70s and 80s who are retiring now, leaving the industry. So they've got very similar issues. Of course, in certain European countries, population is actually declining. So, and that's not, all things being equal, good for the formation of a construction workforce. For productivity growth, I would look to a place like China, as it turns out. I don't know what it is about the Chinese, but they can construct an entire airport in 11 months. If you go to one of their airports, every escalator is always working. And in the United States, every other escalator is working in our airports. So how is that? So somebody is doing something right there. I know the Chinese get a lot of things wrong, including in terms of lack of democracy and freedom of the press and those kinds of things. But in terms of construction, if anyone's been to Shanghai, it's a marvel. It's a 22nd century city, it feels like. They built that. They built that with their construction workforce. And the quality of construction appears to be very, very high. So I think we're probably competitive with Europe, but that doesn't mean we're competitive with the rest of the world. Oddly enough, it might be in some of these emerging countries where we see the most construction productivity growth.
Great. What impact do you see for the industry in pursuit of greening the existing building stock?
Yeah, this is a big deal. And this question comes from Jerry. This is a big deal. And that's because I tell you, this emerging generation, we call them in America millennials. They're mostly in their 30s now. And then younger than them is Generation Z. They're the youngest members of the workforce, Generation Z, born in 1997 and thereafter. That's that group. They care so much about the green economy. When I was growing up, I used to dream about Corvettes and Trans Ams and Camaros and Mustangs. These kids dream about Teslas. They, battery-powered vehicles that make no sound whatsoever. And I like to rock the neighborhood, but they're different. And so they're focused on green energy. They're focused on green construction. They're focused on LEED certification, all these kinds of things. And so as these people become the decision makers in society, as they take over companies, they're going to look for real estate that satisfies their social prerogatives, is what I'm trying to say. And so for building owners who fall behind that green curve, they're going to find that their leasing activity is not as strong as they would like it to be, and that they don't have as much pricing power as they would like, because the move is going to be to those greener, cleaner buildings, including buildings with rooftop gardens and those kinds of things. That's very appealing, particularly to younger people, it would appear, and I think that's where society is headed. So you'll see a lot of greening of the built environment, and that's a very positive thing.
Great. I'll skip over Tom's comment for now, but just go into this question about for modular. We are seeing Canadian banks being nervous in lending money. Do you see this softening in the near future?
Yeah, that's been a problem. This is from an anonymous attendee. This has been a problem forever. And one of the issues for the modular building industry is financing, because banks do not understand, for the most part, modular construction. The issue is this. When you build a building, that often serves as collateral. But people have in mind that modular buildings are simply temporary buildings, and so therefore not particularly good collateral, particularly for long-term loans. And so as a result of that, often projects that use modular techniques are not financed. And this has been, I actually wrote in 2010 a study for the Modular Building Institute about the history of modular buildings and their ability to hold their value over the course of time. And we actually presented that to a group of bankers. I don't know if anyone else has written about this, but that's one of the considerations in modular building. And that's one of the reasons I think that we don't see more modular building than we otherwise would, because of that financing aspect. There are other aspects. There's certain architects who don't like the idea of modular building. They like things built the old-fashioned way. And so they tend to avoid modular building designs. But in any case, yes, it's a great question. Canadian banks and American banks have been nervous for quite some time about modular building and supporting that kind of construction.
Great, thank you. Another question here. The Bank of Canada is projecting interest rates to be back to their 2% target by 2024. Do you think that's realistic? If rates do fall that quickly, how long do you see the trailing effect of higher interest rates lasting?
Right. So I think the question, if I'm not mistaken, Christy, you might be asking, the Bank of Canada is projecting inflation to be back to their 2% target. But they don't target the interest rate, they target the inflation rate. We do the same thing in the United States. The Federal Reserve has a 2% target. As I say, inflation over the past 12 months in our country is running at 8.2%. So they're, of course, raising interest rates to try to get back to that 2% target by slowing the economy. Do I think a 2% target or 2% inflation is realistic by 2024? I do. I think that's realistic. It won't seem like that in 2023, by the way. I think what you'll see in 2023 is, even as the economy slows, inflation is quite slow to follow that path of slowing economic growth. But eventually, I think you'll see some capitulation prices there. Things are going to get pretty tough in North America economically. And so when things are tough, people tend to discount. There'll be some prices that actually fall. And we've already seen some deflation in certain energy prices, natural gas prices and oil prices, for instance. So yeah, I think 2% is realistic. It might be closer to 3% or whatever it happens to be, but a move towards 2% and an ability for the Bank of Canada to start cutting interest rates, I think is eminently possible in 2024.
Okay, we've got time for a couple more questions. Thank you for your time on this, Dr. Bazoo. So we'll keep you while we've got you. But while input costs are up, what level of risk is being added to the bids now?
You skipped the part about West Ham and the Canucks, but that's okay. That's okay. I am a West Ham fan, and we are sitting mid-table. You must be an Arsenal fan, and that's a very nice thing to be right now. So, but the question is, while input costs are up, what level of risk is being added to bids now? I think that, now look, you would know the answer to this better than I would, as a practical matter, because I've never supplied a construction bid. I don't do construction. But what contractors have told me is that for the most part, what they've been able to do is pass along their cost increases to their project owners. Now, I'll give you an example. I am the chief economist, as had been noted in a very kind introduction, of Associated Builders and Contractors. That's the United States, US organization, about 20,000 members, 70 chapters, roughly. And I do a survey of our members each and every quarter. Now, in the most recent Construction Confidence Index survey, a majority of our contractors said they expect revenues to rise in the next 6 months. They expect employment to rise, their employment to rise in the next 6 months. And here's the amazing thing, they expect margins to rise in the next 6 months. And I'm surprised by that, because I see these rising costs and I see weakening economy, and I'm skeptical that project owners will keep paying as much as they've been paying. willing to cover those rising construction costs. But our contractors say, I have lots of backlog, I'm busy, I'm still getting lots of bidding opportunities, and so that's what I think. So, we shall see, but I suspect that over the next 6, 12, 18 months, that you will see less recoupment of those rising construction costs, that margins will be squeezed for many contractors. Again, it's a prediction, but I'll try to explain during this webinar what is my logic.
Great. Have you got time for a couple more questions?
Yeah, go. Let's do it, Chris. Come on.
Great. All right. Do you foresee any loosening of monetary policy if North America falls into recession, or do you think rates will stay high in spite of any potential slowdown?
Andrew, you've asked the question of the day. So I don't know if you noticed, but the Dow Jones in the United States was up 337 points today. So if, and we've seen some days in which the markets have really rallied. So why is this? Why is that happening? And the notion is very simple, that things are getting so tough in the US economy that at some point the Federal Reserve is going to have to pivot and going to have to announce that they're going to no longer keep raising rates. Right? Now, they're going to raise rates on November 2nd. They're going to raise rates in December. What the market is looking past that and trying to figure out if there's a pivot beyond that point. That we start to get in 2023, the economy starts to weaken after the holiday shopping season, and then all of a sudden they say, you know what, we've done enough, we're not going to raise interest rates anymore. The market will just take off like a rocket if the Federal Reserve makes that kind of announcement. And a lot of people are positioning themselves right now by buying equities for that day, for that rally in the market. But if they're wrong, if the Federal Reserve does not pivot, even as the economy weakens, they're going to take massive losses. And that's actually my prediction, that the Federal Reserve will not pivot in a timely fashion, that our Federal Reserve is going to over-tighten. This is the group, by the way, that got us into this problem in the first place. And they've not just damaged the overall US economy, they've damaged the entire global economy, including Canada's. Again, the Americas did that. And so there is a possibility of pivot. Obviously, the market says so. I just don't think they're going to pivot in time to avoid a quite deep recession in the United States.
And so then if that monetary policy does loosen, do you foresee a fast or slow uptick in construction activity?
Yes, I think initially slow because it takes some time for confidence to rebuild, right, among project owners, so on. So it takes a while for jobs to be created. Employment gains are often a lagging indicator. So gross domestic product grows first coming out of a downturn, and then come the jobs and retail sales and those kinds of things. But I would say at some point, I think you will see a quite dramatic recovery in construction activity for a number of reasons. One of them, of course, is we have segments like fulfillment centers, data centers, industrial construction related to manufacturing activity, lots of manufacturing, lots of supply chains coming back to North America. And of course, the population is getting older, which means more demand for healthcare related construction. So there's some segments that are structured to be really strong. I also think you'll see a boom in single family housing construction. Both in Canada and the United States, there's just not enough housing for young people, young families. And the housing, of course, is very expensive, and obviously very expensive in Vancouver and other parts of British Columbia. And so there's a demand out there for housing that more people can access, including the middle class. And so demand for new construction, residential, and often when you see residential construction pick up, you see commercial construction pick up, right? Space for dry cleaners and bank branches and that kind of thing. So it's not going to be immediate, but it would not surprise me if somebody said to me by 2027 or 2028, construction was booming again. It would not surprise me the least.
Great. So there's a two-part. Tom made the comment earlier. It said your left element is worse than ours. And his question relates to the impact on the economy that government labor laws have. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I presume that it means the questioner asks is suggesting that our left of the political spectrum is worse than the Canadian left of the political spectrum. Well, gosh, who could disagree with that? Now, one of the things I try to do, these presentations is I'm trying to focus on the data, to try to focus on objective analysis. So at the end of this presentation, my hope is that you cannot deduce whether or not I'm Republican or Democrat, Labour, Likud, Tory, Bharatiya Janata Party, German Social Democrat. You just can't tell. But I would agree that the left in the United States is really far left and has done a fair amount of damage. And so I'm not a big fan of defund the police, for instance. You might have heard news about a memo that was leaked from the progressive Democrats indicating that maybe they're suggesting the Biden administration should not be supporting Ukraine so strongly. That letter has since been retracted by a policymaker out of the Pacific Northwest. But in any case, yes, our left is problematic, but so is our right. As it turns out, we have a far right in America that's also deeply problematic. And the problem for the United States is, I don't know if you have the same issue in Canada, is the center has become very weak. And I love the center. I love the radical center. I love people who can work with one another, talk to each other, are fact-based, and are not ideological. But in America, one of our issues is that we have become so ideological and so divided politically. And that's one of the reasons that our economic outlook is not especially great.
And Thomas followed that up just out of curiosity, if you're aware, is that he's become aware of Washington state labor laws that are affecting free enterprise. Do you have any insight there?
Yes, I mean, we've seen that for years, right? So minimum wage and support for things like project labor agreements and so on and so forth. Business is tough as it is, right? You and I know that conducting business is tough. It's competitive, it's technical, it's risky. Lots of things can go wrong. I frankly don't know how construction firm operators sleep at night. There's so many things that can go wrong. I should remind you of this, but so many things that can happen on the job, at the job site. That can happen with project owners. That can happen, with whatever it happens to be in the macroeconomic environment. And yet people continue to deliver construction services. It's really quite remarkable. In America, I call construction the wild, wild west. It's really a challenging environment. When policymakers then decided they want to make business that much more difficult, put even more constraints or shackles on business, that is deeply frustrating. Because in a competitive marketplace, if, for instance, you're not treating your employees well, they're going to leave. They'll go to another contractor and then they'll get the work. So the market is a great discipliner, but a lot of these policymakers don't believe in the power of the markets to create great outcomes. So they try to interject themselves into the market. They try to become the market. They think government is the solution. Government is not always the solution. Sometimes it is. But often the private markets work really well to deliver people high quality at a reasonable price.
Great. And there's a question from Manley about where do social procurement initiatives factor into rising costs?
It's a tough one. I have to tell you, we have the same thing in America where we've certain set-asides for certain people and so on and so forth. I'm not a big fan. I'm not a big fan at all of, how should I say this? Discrimination. I think you're best off with a competitive marketplace and further the government intervention, let people rise to their challenges. Discrimination on behalf of one party is discrimination against another. So in any case, I don't mind small business set-asides. I think it makes sense in some level to support small business. They're fledgling, they're underfinanced, they're undercapitalized, so on and so forth. And you want market entry. You want sustainable market entry. So small business set-asides don't bother me whatsoever, but there's so many other interventions in the purchasing markets. I think that it goes a step too far. But in any case, I'll leave it at that.
Great. There's one other comment in there as well. I think this goes back to your discussion about the escalators. It says that the Chinese can construct more quickly because they do modular.
Yes, and I can see that Chinese in this case is spelled with 3 E's, which may be a Canadian thing, I don't know. But the point is, they get the job done. Right. I mean, now there is a construction crisis or a real estate crisis in Canada. Sorry, not in Canada, in China right now, as it turns out. But that has nothing to do with the quality of construction. That has to do with the financial side of things. Yes, I mean, they've been very innovative. They're the leading manufacturers in the world. A quarter of global manufacturing comes from China. And you can see the cities they've built. How many cities are densely populated, really well served by various forms of infrastructure, including mass transit. They're great builders, and that is part of their strength. And that's part of why they're the second largest economy in the world, despite having, political openness. So, in any case, yeah, it's maybe there's something there to learn.
Great. Well, I just wanted to thank you very much, Dr. Basu, on behalf of the BC Construction Association for your presentation today and your extended time to be as gracious as you were in answering the questions. I'd like to thank all attendees for taking the time out of their day to listen to this presentation on providing the economic analysis of BC's industrial, commercial, and institutional construction sectors. in 2022. It was very informative. It wasn't all good news, but at the same time, we have to be realistic if we're going to come out of this together as we go into it together. So thank you very much again for your time on behalf of all of us here in British Columbia and specifically at the BC Construction Association.
Thank you very much, Chris. Thanks a lot. Thanks to all.
Thank
Take
you.
care.